As long as it takes to get whoever I'm talking with to express themselves in every angle around the story. That's because I'm an editor by trade and originally started editing. So I'm always thinking about all the connecting pieces that I would need for the story. So I usually keep a pad and a pen. I never ever try to look down when they're talking to me. This is a university, right? So I'm going to give all my little tips. And then basically I attempt to make it a conversation. It's not an interview. It's really, I reveal as much about myself as is appropriate, as comes up naturally. You know, let them feel your humanity, let them feel that you're not judging them. And then at the end of the interview, realize what your agenda was, what the story is that you're telling, and really try and hone in on those sound bites that you're going to need for the edit. Especially if you're in a faraway place and this is your one shot. You've thought of lines that you need out of this person. You've thought of lines that you need in general for the story, and maybe those, you can plug the person into those, you know, they can be the person that says that line. And literally feed it to them at a certain, like what I hear you saying is, did you say do you mean kind of like this? You know, midwife them into, and then they say, that's what I meant. How about, could you tell me that? Because my voice isn't going to be in this film, you know? You do that kind of thing when you're desperate.
The movies that I've made have both been historical, recent history historical, but they've been historical films. And so there's a different agenda with a historical film than there is with an investigative film or something like that. So the approach of a director is different in that regard. But for me, I love talking heads. I really hate that the idea of talking heads is considered to be a pejorative. And for me, the characters are what makes the movie, so I really try to build a bond with these people as characters.
Yeah, no, I think the bond is what's really important. Ondi, I was interested in feeding the lines. It's really never worked for me. I mean, how do you do it? What's the exact technique to get them?
What I do is I get them to express it in their own words, whatever it is. Well, I ask them a question, and I talk about something. And then when I get to, like we live in public, for example, Josh Harris very much had his own way of expressing things, but it was not good for voiceover. And I needed him to talk about his mother abandoning him when he was young. So we wove around it and went around it and went around it. It was never something I knew I could use in the edit, to the point where I was like, here's kind of what I was thinking as from spending time with this footage that you were feeling. Am I close with this? You know, is this a good diagnosis of what you were feeling? And then he'd say, yeah, that's pretty much true. I said, well, would you say that?
Actually, I mean,
it's like a police officer getting a confession.
Yeah, that's actually never worked for me, but I'm going to keep trying it. But one thing on those lines, sort of in the opposite direction, is I find sometimes if you want somebody to say something with real passion, you say the opposite of what you know they believe. And they go, no, not at all, and then they come back hard. So
one time, and I'm going to show a clip from this film, but you're not going to see this part, but one time I was dealing with a cult leader, and I knew, and I had spent a couple weeks at a treatment center with the people who were in the cult, and I had met him yet, and suddenly I'm at these dinners and, you know, at his house, and I'm trying to get him to talk about what he's done to these children. And I could not figure out how, at every session I left there, and I'd call my mom and say, if I don't call you in 3 hours, call the police. I was sure they were going to dose my food or whatever, and I would go through these sessions, and I'd get great stuff about the Bible and whatever, but I would never get that. So finally, I just said, do you have any advice for me? I cannot get my 2-year-old to behave. I just don't know what to do. And he said, Deborah, go get the fly swatter. And he had his wife go and get the fly swatter, and he said, hold out your hand. You know, oh no, he said, whack my hand, and I whacked his hand, and he said, I can't even feel that. Do it again. You know, it was like amazing. He acted it out. So that kind of thing, like asking advice is another way, or coming against, or sometimes directly confronting them.
But provocation.
Like finally, by the end of the film, I said, I understand that you hit them with a rod. And he went, I mean, it's just brilliant. You know, they got a few spankings, you know. But
okay, so let's back up for a sec. So before we show, yours going to be the first clip. So you guys can cue up Ondi's clip, please. So Do you guys pre-interview? Like, I find myself, I'm co-directing a doc right now, and we have opposite inclinations towards pre-interviewing, meaning, you know, talking to them ahead of time, getting their story ahead of time. One of us really likes to pre-interview, the other one doesn't ever want to pre-interview. So we're trying to find that balance. I'm curious, each of you, how you deal with that.
I mean, in the stuff that I've done, I felt very, very, very strongly against pre-interviewing. And actually, it's interesting because when I've done Q&As with the people in my cast, at screenings, they've often told this story that once I had asked them if they would be in the film, when the subject matter would come up, I would say, because I didn't want any of it to be not fresh. And with We Were Here, which is the current movie, I was able to interview without having done any, I mean, you'll see it came very much from my own personal experience in San Francisco, but with the COCKETTES, I had an enormous amount of material available that gave me the ability to go into the interviews, never having discussed any of that information with these people, and I knew a lot. I mean, I knew their whole sex lives from other people's stories. And so the freshness to me is crucial to have on camera. I think the pre-interviewing really kills the freshness.
Yes and no. I mean, I think it depends on who it is.
Depends on the movie.
Yeah. Well, it depends on who it is. Some people can say the same thing over and over incredibly well, and so it's good to know everything that they can say. That's not. I mean, that's maybe 1 out of 4 people. It's also good to have like a producer or something do it as well. I mean, it really depends. I mean, I find when you're getting very sort of extensive stories from people. When you do an interview, I mean, you go down this road and that road and that road, and you inevitably leave some, you know, path, you know, untrodden or whatever. And so, I think it's good to have some of that information in advance if you can.
I mean, it's ideal if you're in your situation and you just have all this knowledge to not have that interaction, but. Sometimes it's really a one-shot deal, and you kind of don't have the budget to come back, or this person's going to make 1 hour, or this person's a congressman and they're going to make 20 minutes for you. And you better know what you're going for. But if it can be not you who does it, but a researcher or a producer or something, so that when you come in there it's fresh and they're telling you the information for the first time, right. then you kind of have the best of both worlds.
I guess, but I think there's this trust issue. You know, for me, sometimes pre-interviewing is about establishing a trust, and then it's about not having them actually, stop them in a story. Okay, don't go any farther. Save that for the camera. You know, but that kind of
it establishes a rapport.
I'm trying to create a rapport and a bond with people.
I think my producer exaggerates or something, but she did an excellent job, so she really pulled it off. Well, anyway.
Well, we're going to do that later, like the hard-to-get interviews, okay. But how do you establish trust? So the military didn't trust you, right?
You know, I cut my hair short.
You dress for the occasion.
You dress for the occasion. I mean, they want, you know, I mean, anybody coming to you in that situation is sort of, you know, doing PR. So they actually are reaching out to you in a lot of ways, and that's the problem. Is how do you get through that? Right, they never trusted us. I mean, I think maybe one person trusted us.
Did you crack them?
No, I didn't really want that person. I mean, I was hoping, you know, if they trust you, it's already easier to crack them. Everybody else was just like this, and then we had other ways to get through.
Ondi, so how do you earn trust for people that don't trust you?
Well, in the case of the man you're about to see, what I did was just tell, and this is where manipulation does come in. I mean, quite honestly, he had written a book called Revelation Simplified, where he was simplifying the book of Revelations, and in so doing, distorting the text. And I met with a Harvard professor, dissected it and all that. But he saw me, he actually said to me, I see you as God sent you. Because I said I'm interviewing a bunch of pastors through the South, and I had interviewed other pastors. But where I sort of was telling an untruth, as it were, was that it was really not all about, you know, Book of Revelations. And that's how I first got to meet him. I couldn't say, I've just spent 2 weeks at a cult treatment center with all of your congregants hearing about your vicious crimes, you know? Would you care to comment? You know, there's no way. And I had no film without him. And I also thought he would come off as a total monster if I didn't put his point of view in. And if I put his point of view in from the defensive up front, I wouldn't be doing justice to him. So this is how I justified my untruth. But it was pretty good justification. And so I just said, you know, can we talk about the Book of Revelations? And I talk about what is interesting to that person, whatever it is. So I usually start out by having a person talk about themselves or what they're most passionate about, whether that's what I want them to talk about in the end or not. And that really gets things flowing, you know, and allows them to feel respected and that they're expressing their point of view. I mean, I've even been pulled over before, you know, and just asked the police officer her point of view. And like, she asked me to turn off the camera, and I said, well, I believe it's my right to leave it on. And she said, turn that off right now. And I said, well, actually, could you show me in a book of law, because I believe it's my right to keep it on. And she said, I said, turn it off. I said, actually, I'm out here as a documentary filmmaker filming this event, and I'm wondering why you're pulling people over. There's kids dying out there. As soon as she was off to the races talking about why she was stopping this whole thing, she said, you have a nice day, and just like let me go. So it's the power of the camera and of just kind of, people want to express themselves.
Well, it's empathy. I was talking about this with your mom, actually.
My mother already?
Right.
5 minutes. That's not surprising. My mom.
But I remember interviewing Al Maisels once, and I said, what's the most important quality for a documentary filmmaker? And he said, empathy. I mean, no surprise he was a psychologist, but it is empathy. We have to establish that empathy with our subjects.
It was the crossover, but from their point of view to his. And it was just a really interesting time. We literally did follow them home. And it was amazing how it turned to darkness and it turned to lightning as we got to South Carolina. It all truly happened that way. I'm always just so moved by Paris, a 9-year-old, having to deal with her mother attempting suicide and then spinning her, you know, yo-yo around, saying, I'm just worried. You know, I mean, carrying that weight of her mother potentially dying by her own hand at any time. And then it's just amazing that the first moment, and it's funny because first moments, you talk about pre-interviews, first moments are so important, and I suggest you always roll on your first moment, you know, and sometimes you forget because you're nervous, but first time you're going to meet a character, roll. Just roll your camera, because you never know. I've used it, I don't think I've met Josh Harris on camera, but I met Anton at the beginning of Dig on camera, and here I meet Raymond on camera, and he threatens to whip me, actually, because I was late.
But one of the things I think so remarkable about, one of the many things, Ondi, about your films is that the interviews never feel like interviews. You know, they're masked, they're fly on the wall. I mean, I guess there's some, you know, there was a lady sitting in a hotel room, or she's one of the deep.
Yeah, David, I love a good talking head.
But yours never feel like talking heads.
I like a good chest.
Like, so how do yours don't feel like talking heads?
I think it's just in the moment, you know, if you catch somebody and actually the moment, and it's when you step into a scene and when you hang back, so you never, it's a feeling kind of thing. I mean, I could say something as scary as Werner said, and said, you know, you're either just bored to do this or not, but I mean, I don't think that's it. I think it's just like you get a sense after a time of doing this of hanging back and letting the action happen. But I remember being like 22 years old, 21, and getting a position on a documentary that was going to be about rodeo girls, and I remember being really frustrated. The directors of the film were a couple, and I guess they were having discord, and they ended up breaking up. But nonetheless, and I don't know if it would have been different otherwise, but they never ever interacted with the subjects. They'd hang back and verite, but you can't do that. I mean, I can't do that. I haven't been able to figure out how to do verite. I do verite all the time. That's what you're saying, is that it feels like I'm always a fly on the wall. But I also interact.
But that's the trick, is knowing when to interact and when to back
when. Yeah, there's those spaces in between in life, and we all have them, where you can jump in, where you've just gotten off the phone in the car, and you're walking into your house, and you haven't yet reached your child or the fridge. You know what I mean? In that period of time, if I'm rolling camera, I'm going to ask you about the phone call or what you're feeling about what's going to happen next. And in that moment, I'm going to get a much more fluid response, perhaps, than a different response, an in-the-moment response, than I will 2 weeks from then when you can look back on it.
Yeah, the key in-the-moment response is really key.
Unfolding. I mean, I feel like most exciting films unfold over time. That's why people go to the movies to watch scripted films. That's what we can do if we follow things that are real.
Kind of the most interesting places to interview people is in a car when they're driving. Because they're sort of semi in a zone or semi-distracted, and somehow the interview seems much more casual than if you were, even though it's almost the same setup, right, except for the driving, as opposed to asking the same questions in a chair or something like that.
Because they're on a journey.
They're on a journey too, right? And there's always things to interact with it that are you can cut away to, or it can suddenly change the subject in interesting ways.
There is some, but there's almost no music at all during the interviews. And I was also really determined to leave people on screen and to allow their process to play out in real time, rather than to, you know, as is more conventionally done, to cut it. And it was really about not only maintaining a sense of authenticity for the audience, but allowing the audience in some way to share a real-time emotional experience with the people on screen. But this was an interesting one to look at, because I'd never really thought about how long this one goes on.
So two out of two clubs have mentioned suicide, and hopefully there's no suicide in your club.
Just the idea of telling, even narrowing the story down to San Francisco, to tell a 30-year history of AIDS in San Francisco was such a kind of a daunting thing, and I didn't know how many people I would have in the film. I didn't know how I would approach it, and it happened very organically, and I realize now that my intuitions were very strong about what I did and didn't want to do, even if I couldn't have articulated it. But all of the people who were in the film are people who I did know a little, and just happened to run into. There's only one person who I knew in advance that I was going to interview, and it's because I knew his history and I thought he would be a good experiment to see how this process would play out. But Daniel I ran into at a demonstration, and I'd known him peripherally for many, many years, and in the course of talking to him I thought, you know, Daniel would be great for this. And part of the casting was in the process of asking people if they were interested in realizing through their response whether they got the value of doing it, not only for the audience, which all of them had a sense of that, but also for their own process of catharsis. So everybody in the film is someone who I happened to bump into somewhere along the line and say, oh, you want to be in the movie. I thought initially that I would have to do about 30 or 40 interviews for the film and then maybe pick 12, and I only wound up doing 9, and there's 5 in the film. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. What allowed him to cry was that he would be telling his story, and he'd look at me and Marcia and Loretta, and we'd all have tears pouring down our faces, and it gave him the encouragement. So I think the empathy piece was unique on this project simply because this story being told is exactly the period that I lived in San Francisco. So they knew that where I was coming from was not a, you know, an external thing. So it was like 25 years of therapy for both people wrapped into a 3-hour interview. So it was very intense.
I actually had my producer, Amy Ziering, do a lot of the interviews, particularly with the women, because it was, these are women who were raped in the military. And one of the challenges, actually, is because, particularly in cases where it was relatively recent, although with something like that, it never goes away, but is actually to keep them from crying early on, because once they break, they're in a totally different state. It can be hard to cut, and there's a lot of information. You always kind of want to, when you're cutting, hold the break. As you know, you want to write kind of getting closer and closer and closer, but you know, you want to hold back in a way. And if they break too soon, then the whole interview goes into this other kind of state, and it can be harder to use. So it's something, when you're interviewing somebody and you see it's going toward a sensitive direction, you know, oftentimes I would try to actually pull back and then, you know, start talking about other things and then slowly come back at it again, at the event or whatever was really traumatic for them.
Right.
That committee is Joan Graves, and I think she'd only given a very few number of interviews, and mostly to very sort of friendly trade kind of papers. And so we couldn't get an interview with her, and we really wanted it. And so basically the only opportunity I had was to, once I submitted my film for a rating, then she was sort of obligated to call me back and discuss the rating with me. So in California, you can't record somebody's voice without their permission, which is why if you're in New York or Las Vegas, it's a much easier place to make films. So there's actually about 38 states. That's the one-way taping states, and if you're in one of those states, you're very lucky. But anyway, so what we did is we actually the first interview, she called me 3 times. The first time she did agree to be taped, and after that I think she got kind of wise, but we ended up using animation and sort of writing notes, and basically in this case having our associate producer, who was also a voiceover artist, redo her voice. So that also gives you a chance to, redo the interview, if you will.
Well, you stepped from being the filmmaker to not just the observer, to being the participant observer. Did you plan that from the beginning, or did the absence of the interview, make that happen?
Yeah, no, to some degree I planned that from the beginning. I was following my process. I mean, I was doing interviews, of course, but then I knew that I was going to submit the film that I made, and part of that actually was following around a PI, and my producer was actually shooting a lot of this stuff like this. He was shooting this, and so I became a subject. I mean, you know, it was sort of pretty natural. He was affected his nuclear family, his mother, his community, and his relationship to his church. And in this case, it's a scene where he has a discussion with his mother. And initially it was set up as an interview with the two of them, and I was able to transform it into more of a kind of a verite scene, and I'll explain how afterwards. Now, it's because I actually obeyed the time limits of, you know, I actually cut it down, so it's a kind of a cut down scene, so it might seem a little bit choppy. You know, there was something that obviously was unspoken that they still had to work out between them. So this obviously works with 2 or 3 people, and what you do is you sit down and, you know, it's not, you know, sort of an informal interview. You're just, you know, again, it was my producer shooting this, and you just start talking to them, asking them questions, and you get to sort of what the sensitive point is between them, and then you start, you start asking them these questions, and then when they look back at you, you look down, and then they sort of will naturally look to the person they're with. And if they come back at you, you just say, well, can you say that to Tony, or can you say that to your mom? And you just kind of keep going. I mean, this was over about an 1.5-hour period. And you just kind of keep going at the same issue and going at the same issue, and then, of course, you get your coverage. And you know, probably 75% of the scene was spoken to the camera, but there was enough of it, about 25%, that gave you an opportunity to cut it as a verite scene, as if you were there in this discussion, which, you know, sort of did happen many times, but never happened with this intensity, finally happened. So it really it's a verite scene that's sort of set up by an interviewer.
I call it facilitating a conversation.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Ondi, you must do that a lot.
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, you just say, I'm not here, that's what I do. So I'm really not here, I'm just not here.
But just because you say that doesn't mean that
well, they say, they try to work with me on that. I'm like, really try to talk to each other, I'm not here. And then I throw, and I do this actually in something I'm shooting currently, I do this all the time. It's a tech startup, and they're always having these interactions, and I want them to have interactions amongst themselves, but I want to make sure certain topics are discussed, and so I throw in the words, and they're used to me now, and they'll work with it. They'll run with that topic, next topic, you know, and so I'm sort of directing the conversation, but not in it. And then sometimes if they do break it and they look right at the camera, it's because they've become emotional, or they're calling the judgment of the camera up, you know, and that's interesting too. So, but with Join Us, we had to do that a lot, where we had in South Carolina, we were recording phone calls all the time. That was awesome. And we would have them get together, and we would have them get together to make a phone call to each other, because one of the characters lived kind of far away, Tanya, who was the one who was struggling the most. And it was incredible. We had them call the lawyer together and then do the boxes, you know, where they'd all be in their own little place. We'd have like 4 cameras wherever they were, and you can have a lot of, I don't know, it's just interesting as a filmmaker. It's totally a lie to say that you're not a part of it, because you are. You're making a film, therefore everything's changed now. Understand the emotional truth of life, right? Theoretically? You agree? The MPAA, I guess it's not the emotional truth of life, but the system. We want to break down the system. Whatever we want to do, we want to kind of open it up, right? And so sometimes, and we want to have the viewer feel like they are directly interacting with it, so that it's not a passive experience.
You know, dealing with the questions that you have, and dealing with the outline, and dealing with the subject matter that you know that you need. And the other side of it, which is really allowing the spontaneity of the moments to present the information in ways that happen organically. And you have to do both of those. And I think on my first film, on the COCKETTES, I had my co-director with me, and he had a big outline of, he had a big outline of information that we knew that we needed, and I would follow a much more organic process, and then, you know, we'd break every 15 minutes, and he would sort of say, well, try to get to this, try to get to that. On this movie, it was very different. I really, really allowed for the organic process to take place, partially because I knew it was therapeutic. I knew that on some level, I owed it to the person who was in the room to talk about whatever they needed to talk about, and it was not my place to direct the interview too much. And so it was very natural, the process, and to some degree, you know, I certainly was very aware of editing. I certainly was very aware of what information I wanted, but I wasn't necessarily sure which information would come from which person, and I also knew that the finished movie would, to some degree, be determined by what came up in the interviews that I couldn't entirely control. So it's very different, I think, when you're doing a history interview, and I really like, I mean, I've been interviewed a lot also. I mean, I think all of us have been interviewed, and I really like when I feel like an interviewer is not coming from just questions, but when someone is actually having an organic moment and responding. It's like in a personal conversation when you're having dinner with someone, you want to know that someone's listening to you and that they're going to ask you a question not based on what they'd rehearsed, but based on what you just said. And they'll go, oh, well, that's interesting, and then it goes places that you don't necessarily expect.
I have to make sure I'm not misunderstood, though. I don't ever come at it like that, with an agenda like that. It's more of, it's always a dialogue. It's always a conversation, and that's what I think when I see a new field producer or a new documentary director trying to do an interview. That's like mistake number one, is I have my 10 questions, and whatever that person says, I'm moving on to number 3 now, you know, and that just kills it. Right. You know, it's all about whatever that person wants to talk about. But you also have certain things that you need to get to, places you need to get to, and you'll get there, but it never happens in the order you plan. Right. Hey, I'm Jack. Whoa, and that's arcane. That's it.
I mean, one of the things I love in the open and We Live in Public is Josh is talking about, he's kind of giving a forecast of how the internet seems so cool and how actually really deadly and insidious it is. And it starts on this tight shot of him on a computer, it looks like a Skype interview, and it pulls out and suddenly he's on 25 screens and 25 computers. I mean, that's a brilliant use of imagery in an interview.
That was, it's funny because in cutting We Live in Public, it was an 8-month edit, and 5,000 hours of footage, and during that time I was really just editing the film, but I always had the opening. I never didn't have the opening, and the graphics guy, the poor graphics guy, had to work the whole 8 months on that opening too, because he was like, what are you talking about? You know, because there's 2 main titles that flash on the screen, because I love both. He's like, you want them both? Like, they want to look different, and it was just the idea that he was saying goodbye to his mother over a video camera. And that was the whole point of how disconnected he was from real human emotion because of technology. And then that turns into his prediction of the internet. As it does, he becomes, he's clearly shared too much, and now he's on YouTube with his, you know, his private moment is now out there for everybody. And then, yeah, it's all about the screens and the virtual boxes we put ourselves in. So the whole movie's actually, you don't have to see past the first, it's like a minute and a half. I don't want to take up people's time anyway.
And what I found worked in several interviews was to take the point where I knew that they were the weakest and just kind of go at it, go away from it, come back, go away, and they were getting more and they were getting more and more frustrated. It was like they kept wanting to, they couldn't say the same thing over and over. I mean, the ones who were really good did, but some of them did, and they started trying to answer it in different ways, and that's, you know, once you start doing that, really, if you're giving an interview, you know, you should just give up. Because you're going to lose.
You're pissing them off, and it worked.
Well, it wasn't quite pissing. Yeah, it was that. It was a little bit, you go just right to the edge, you know. It was, you know.
Playing dumb almost. What's wrong with this person? Didn't they hear what I just said? Yeah.
Right, yeah. So that seemed to work. The other thing I was just thinking about in interviews, and I noticed this when I interviewed myself, I love it when people just completely change the subject on me and go in a completely different direction. And I'm always, when I'm doing these interviews, and you know, you think, well, maybe this isn't going exactly where I want. How and when can I come in from a totally different direction that will completely surprise them? I mean, and it's a very delicate, complex thing to figure out when you want to do that, because if you do it at the wrong time, they just kind of look at you like. But if you hit them at the right time, it's so unexpected that they suddenly just kind of go into that kind of opening.
But you can't throw them off balance too much, right?
You can't, yeah. I mean, it can't seem like sort of, you know, plotted or right. You know, any kind of got you in any way, but it's just like, oh, you know, it's just a whole new subject. It's like, you know, changing the topic in a conversation.
I'm dying to be interviewed by you now. Here we go, just do an interview.
We We could role play.
It's kind of great.